Museum today for our program. And today I'd like to welcome Dr. Rebecca Rowe. She's a professor up at East Texas A&M University. And she's going to be talking today about A Studio at War, Comfort, Duty, and the Disney Touch. And I have to admit, I love Disney, so that's one of my favorite things. In fact, I told her that last fall I went with some friends and we went to San Francisco, and that's where the Disney Museum is also. So we got to go there. So that was a lot of fun. And this month's sponsor is Chip Cole, so I thank him for helping us out this month. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Rebecca.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to hear about Disney during World War II. Before we get started, a couple of things. One, on most of the slides, you'll see the QR code. It moves around the slide depending on the slide design, but it's in the top right-hand corner right now. There will also be a URL link, again, somewhere on the slide. If you scan the code or go to the link, either one, it'll take you to a Google Drive folder where you can find a copy of the notes I'll be reading from as well as the slides. I do that for two reasons. One, I cannot caption myself. So if you're the kind of person who likes to see words in front of your face while you're listening to something, you can scan these and you can go look at the notes and follow along. Two, I found so much fun stuff putting this together, and if you want to look at it later, you can scan it, you'll get the presentation, and you can check out all of the primary sources more closely at your own leisure. So just to give you all a heads up, those will be up for the whole time. So if you're like, I don't need it, and then you're like, no, I have to watch the rest of that short, you can stay out later. And the other part of that is I planned too much for today, I'm going to be honest with y'all, so we're going to see how much we can get through. But there's just so much to say about Disney and World War II. So with those little announcements out of the way, hi, I am Dr. Rebecca Rowe, Assistant Professor of Children's Literature at East Texas A&M University and founding editor of the International Journal of Disney Studies. So I spend a lot of time with Disney, and I'm so excited to bring this part of Disney's history to life for y'all today. So, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese military launched an aerial attack on Pearl Harbor, which of course would eventually lead the U.S. to join World War II. On December 8th, 1941, 500 U.S. soldiers began an occupation of Walt Disney Studios that would last 8 months. They weren't stationed there because Disney was in trouble or anything like that. It's because there was a Lockheed aircraft plant close by, and so they were just using Disney as a place to store soldiers to protect the plant. However, Walt Disney Studios was the only Hollywood studio that was occupied either then or at any point in Hollywood's Hollywood's history. So it is this weird little thing, and it's a great indicator of the relationship that existed between the Disney Disney Studios and the government at the time. In those 8 months, the soldiers, quote, repaired equipment in the large soundstage, stored ammunition in the parking sheds, and posted guards at all of the entrances, end quote. They even had someone who was stationed in Walt's office for the entire 8 months, I guess as a go-between between the government and Walt. So this occupation really does represent a long and fruitful relationship between Disney and the U.S. government, which is, of course, my focus for today. So today I'm going to focus on Disney's World War II propaganda, especially their cartoons. I'm specifically going to focus on why they made the propaganda, why it was so effective, and how we know that it was effective. So, starting with, there's our friends. What did Disney make? So we're going to be starting with those cartoons, the propaganda. Throughout the war, Disney made more than 400,000 feet of educational war films for every branch of the service, enough to make a continuous movie that was 68 hours in length. And if that sounds like a lot, it should, because they went from making about 27,000 feet of film a year to 204,000 feet of film per year in 1943. 94% of the 204,000 feet was produced for the government at cost. So they ramped up their production in a huge way, at the same time that they were losing employees who were going and serving in the war. So the fact that they were able to do it is kind of impressive. You may notice that in none of what I just read, or really anything that the Disney company produced or endorsed at the time, does anyone call what they made propaganda. There are a few reasons for that. One, propaganda kind of gets a bad reputation. From the perspective of our modern information and communication age, the word propaganda continues to imply something evil, the enemy of independent thought, and an intrusive and unwanted manipulator of the free flow of information and ideas in humanity's quest for peace and truth. It is a dirty trick utilized by hidden persuaders, mind manipulators, and brainwashers, Orwellian big brothers who somehow subliminally control our thoughts in order to control our behavior to serve their interests rather than our own. So there's definitely evil propaganda in the world, or more accurately, propaganda intended to convince people to do or think evil things. But propaganda in its most literal sense, which is the sense I'll be using today, is really no more than the communication of ideas designed to persuade people to think and behave in a desired way. It differs, or should do, from education in that the imparting of information and ideas for educational purposes is to enable the recipient to make up his or her own mind on any given issue. Propaganda is about persuading people to do things which benefit those doing the persuading, either directly or indirectly. So in wartime, that usually means getting them to fight or support the fight, right? Which is what we're going to see Disney doing in the shorts we look at today. So in short, propaganda is just very, very persuasive rhetoric that has a particular message and a particular intent. So why would the US government want to use animation for this kind of rhetoric? There are a lot of different ways to answer that question, but the one we're going to focus on today has to do with how the medium of animation works. So according to Gerard C. Brady, some specific elements of cartoons make them conducive to propaganda, notably many humorous styles and visual devices, a medium that exaggerates and hyperbolizes actions, the ability to mold reality in unreal ways, and then the reception of it. So people associated cartoons with something whimsical and jocular and let their guard down when they saw cartoons because they were expecting to be entertained, not recruited for war, which meant the characters are traditionally non-threatening and people wanted to engage with it, right? Versus a lot of propaganda. You're aware it's propaganda and you're more critical about it. So cartoons use exaggerated visuals and sound effects to communicate meaning, often through humor or inspiration, which we'll be seeing today. And then people are often less critical and thus more susceptible when watching cartoons. That makes them a perfect vehicle for any kind of propaganda. But Walt didn't want his work to be considered propaganda, which is why the material around these texts often label them educational films instead of propaganda. Wallace Duell, a member of the Wartime Coordinator's Office, wrote in a memo that Walt Disney is fearful of being labeled as a propagandist in the public mind, with consequent damage to his reputation as a whimsical, non-political artist. To us today, that might sound silly. Walt Disney didn't want to be seen as whimsical, but Disney had a very different reputation back then. Many adults not only watched these early Disney shorts and films, but also believed such work was on par with artists such as Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Bruegel, Rembrandt, and Picasso, among others. They thought that what he was able to achieve with animation was the pinnacle of art in the 20th century at this point in time. Obviously that changed. So, instead of propaganda, the company more or less framed their work in this period as edutainment. Edutainment is a portmanteau of education and entertainment, and it is the seamless integration of learning objectives into engaging and entertaining content. Edutainment isn't technically a term that Disney would use regularly until the 1950s, but their animation during the war paved the road for what they would eventually call edutainment. Walt himself liked to describe his wartime cartoons in a way that seems to call on such definitions of edutainment. So once he said, it is a new kind of entertainment that goes far beyond simply amusing its audience. This picture is Vital Entertainment. It treats on a subject that directly affects every man, woman, and child in America. With dramatic action, it exposes the basic ideas that will rid the mind of confusion and clarify the war thinking to the public. And this was about victory through war power, which is one of his animations we're going to look at in a bit. He was also willing to justify his particular form of education. The war has taught us that people who won't look at a book will look at a film. Mass education is coming. It's coming because it's a necessity. Democracy's ability to survive depends on the ability of its individuals to appreciate their duties as citizens and to comprehend the complex problems of the changing world we live in. So he saw the propaganda he made as not only okay, but also his duty as an American to make. While combining education and entertainment is the hallmark of basically any piece of children's media, Disney developed a very specific way of combining these two elements that has gone on to influence really all of children's media and really a lot of educational media in general. So the fact that like they own National Geographic now, things like that, everything has started kind of taking on that Disney touch. So were Disney's cartoons propaganda or were they edutainment? The answer is yes. So if we look at our definitions side by side, propaganda and edutainment, we have the communication of ideas designed to persuade people to think and behave in a desired way to benefit those doing the persuading either directly or indirectly versus the seamless integration of learning objectives into engaging and entertaining content using dramatic action to expose the basic ideas that will rid the mind of confusion and clarify the war thinking of the public. So the overlap, they both use different rhetorical strategies that are engaging or entertaining and or draw on the audience's emotions, ultimately to persuade people. So while Walt didn't want to call this propaganda and preferred to think of his cartoons as education, I'm going to use the term propaganda because it's accurate and it is what most media and Disney historians call Disney cartoons from this period. So instead of just describing these very strange cartoons to y'all, and the impact they had, I'm going to show clips from 5 different animations that they made during this time period. And for each, I'm going to talk about how Disney used the entertaining or at least engaging rhetorical strategies available to the animated medium to persuade people, often by appealing to their emotions, so we can think about what's going on in the time period. So, not all of Disney's propaganda was designed for the same purposes. Some of the animation commissioned by the US government was intended as training videos for enlisted and drafted soldiers, while others were intended to rally support back home. We're going to focus on the training films first, and I'm going to be honest with you, this is the most boring film. We're going to get through it, it's going to be fine. All right, a lot of the animation Disney made for the military didn't appear in films solely produced by the studio. Instead, they would animate pieces that supported other propaganda efforts, such as the first motion picture unit, or Frank Capra's Signal Corps, which most famously made Why We Fight, which included animated segments from Disney. This poster, Prelude to the War, is the first part of Why We Fight. And it was a series of films intended to teach soldiers the history of how the U.S. got into the war and why the U.S. was right for being in it. And this is just a reminder that like all of the Hollywood studios were making propaganda. It wasn't just like Disney doing their thing, but how Disney did it was really interesting. So when Disney was animating things for these live action films, usually what they were doing was animating maps and graphs, things that were easier for people who are used to drawing to make than the live action filmmakers. And we'll see some of that in one of the later videos. Disney did make some training films on their own, especially for the Navy, who was their biggest client. Disney's first and biggest military client, they requested 90,000 feet of film on December 8th, 1941. That was their first contract to come through. It was the day after Pearl Harbor. So we're going to watch a clip from one of those training videos made for the Navy. It's called Fog. It was part of the Aeriology series designed to teach new pilots about different weather conditions and how those weather conditions would impact their planes. I sped this up to 1.25 times because, good Lord, it's not fun, but it is really interesting. So the first thing I want to point out is how these training films were built, right? So this is produced under the supervision of the Bureau of Aeronautics by Walt Disney Productions, right? So if you know anything about early Disney, Walt had to have his name on everything. Like, he was very passionate about it. But he would be sharing billing with whoever hired him for each of these cartoons until we get later into the war, and I'll show you how that changed later on. Okay. Sorry, this one is also the quietest of all the videos, so just breathe softly. And listen. There it is.
The dew point is a variable factor and will increase as the air absorbs more moisture by evaporation. The air temperature also varies and will decrease as the air is cooled by contact with a cold surface. When the descending temperature due to contact cooling and the ascending dew point caused by the addition of moisture through evaporation become equal, fog will form.
Oh. Shoot.
Again.
No.
The air is cooled by contact with a cold
All right.
surface.
While that's still running, because y'all can probably hear me better than you hear that. One of the things that we're seeing in here is that animation allows you to visualize things that aren't actually visible, like temperature. So the medium of animation actually has very specific grammar for communicating things like temperature, like condensation, there we go. Things like that. So it makes animation great for teaching, for training films when you're trying to teach people how weather works, right? Also, a quick note, this was narrated by Art Baker, who did a lot of educational Disney films. In some ways, we can almost hear him as the studio's educational voice, tying these training videos to Disney's larger educational catalog. And that's something that you see, there's a lot of ways that Disney is trying to be like, hey, remember it's Disney doing this, don't forget, we're here, right? So even just using the same voice actors that they use for their normal stuff is a way of doing that. All right. Last clip we're gonna watch from this one.
One pilot out of the A-team estimated the situation correctly and proceeded inland, knowing that this type of fog is usually confined to the immediate coastal plains region, and that a few miles inland, open fields might be suitable for a safe landing. 15 of the planes circled over the fog until their gas supply was gone. The crews then bailed out. Two of the pilots attempted to land in the fog and crashed.
Alright, so this was based on a real story that happened in the US Navy Air Force. The reason you have Disney doing this is because at the time period they couldn't effectively film flying, crashes, certain kinds of weather, right? They didn't have the technology to do that kind of live action filming. And this is one of the reasons why a large chunk of Disney's training videos were focused on aviation. It's one of the things they did most consistently. They actually had a lot of their animators and writers in-house were doing all of this aviation research. They worked with pilots. Like, it's amazing the amount of research that went into these. And fun fact, if you're like me and didn't know this, while the Army and Navy both had aerial units during World War II, the actual US Air Force didn't exist until after the war, which is why you'll hear me talking about the Navy and the Army hiring him to talk about planes, right? Which seems a little weird for us today. The idea that animation can capture things that live action film can't is actually how Walt sold the idea of the series to the Navy. He said, although certain climactic conditions are a regular happening, photography is not always available or capable of portrayal. A production based on various weather conditions can best be expressed, portrayed, then diagnosed by the animation medium. So he knew very well that animation had this particular talent that he could use in order to get these jobs, which is what he wanted. So how do we know this was effective? The Navy used these throughout the war, and after seeing the first 3 training films, Fog was one of the first 3, they ordered a bunch more of these kinds of training videos. They also had Disney turn these into pamphlets. Those pamphlets were used for decades after the war was over. So apparently Disney got something right with them. All right, so the second thing that we really see these propaganda shorts doing is selling the war at home. The military wasn't Disney's only government client. Plenty of other offices in the US government requested animation. Perhaps most famous is its first non-military propaganda commission, which is the New Spirit 1942, made for the US Department of the Treasury. So to give you some background, the Revenue Act of 1942, designed to raise money for the war efforts, made it so many Americans would be paying income tax for the very first time, and as you can probably guess, people were not amused, right? Before the act was even passed, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau commissioned Disney to create a cartoon to encourage citizens to pay their taxes quickly and happily. They made the New Spirit to do that. And just a quick note on these cartoons, the shorts that were made for the public, these would play in normal cinemas. You would go to the cinema, and it would start with a few shorts. You'd probably get an animation, a newsreel, whatever, and then you'd watch your feature film, right? So people are just going to the cinema for funsies, and they're getting these shorts. Again, this is why their critical awareness was maybe lower than it usually is. So, in this short, The New Spirit, I should definitely say 1942, Donald Duck learns why he should pay his taxes and is even instructed on how to do so. So let's check this out. Just like with the last one, you can see here at the bottom, the film distributed and exhibited under the auspices of the War Activities Committee motion picture industry. So every time in the early years that Disney was making one of these propaganda, they labeled it very clearly. All right. This one's much louder, so hopefully we can actually hear. Fingers crossed.
There is a new spirit in America. The spirit of a free people, united again in a common cause to stamp tyranny from the earth. Our very shores have been attacked. Your whole country is mobilizing for total war. Your country needs you. Are you a patriotic American? Eager to do your part? Then there's something important you can do. You won't get a medal for doing it. It may mean a sacrifice on your part. But it will be a vital help to your country in this hour of need. Shall I tell you what it is? Shall I? Your income tax. Your income tax. It may not seem important to you, but it is important. Yes, and it's your privilege. Not just your duty, but your privilege to help your government by paying your tax and paying it promptly. What's the big hurry? Your country is at war. Your country needs taxes for guns, taxes for ships, taxes for democracy, taxes to beat the Axis.
He goes, oh boy. Anyway, taxes to beat the Axis. So we get a lot of the normal kind of propaganda language in here. They're evil, they're coming for you, you can do something about it, do the thing, right? We also get catchy phrases like taxes to beat the Axis, which was originally coined for this short, but was used by the US government after the short came out. All of that is just normal propaganda stuff, you know, whatever. So what does this cartoon add as a cartoon? It shows Donald reacting the way most people would when hearing about taxes, right? None of us actually want to think about that. When Treasury Secretary Morgenthau had commissioned this, he had hoped.
There is a new spirit in America.
Yes, okay. He had hoped Disney would create a new character, a sort of Mr. Average Taxpayer, who would take a somewhat more sober approach than the Duck did in dramatizing the virtues of paying taxes in full and on time. Disney argued for making the painful business seem to be as much fun as possible. The secretary countered by claiming that he did not like Donald Duck. There are at least 2 versions of Disney's reply, but in effect he noted with some heat that his giving the Treasury the Duck was the equivalent of MGM's giving the Treasury Clark Gable. He was the studio's top star. He was often called the Gable of the stable. Donald Duck was. As this quote highlights, even before the war, thank you, Donald Duck had long been a vicarious outlet for his audience's civilized repression of uncivilized urges, making him popular during the Great Depression when there was a lot of frustration going around. When Donald was then drafted into the war effort in Disney's cartoons, he is the he is the same pre-war collection of human frailties dressed up in olive drab, a state of affairs familiar to many a young draftee at the time. So in short, while the studio's iconic Mickey Mouse may have seemed too innocent and, dare I say, naive for the Great Depression and then World War II, Donald was the everyman Morgenthau wanted. Morgenthau just didn't seem to realize that everyman represented Americans who were frazzled and frustrated and scared. The perfect Donald Duck, right? So it goes on to show you, like, he walks Donald through the entire process of filling out the form. Like, you see the tax form on the screen while Donald fills it out with all of his information. It's like really weird. We're gonna skip that for time's sake. But it does what Walt wanted it to, which is to add some humor into this painful process, right? But then we get into the more kind of propaganda-y side of the short. Let's see if I can find it easily. See him filling out his form with the help of magical tools because Disney.
Would you sign here, please?
$13 for taxes.
My taxes. Our taxes that run the factories. Taxes to keep them fighting. Taxes to keep them rolling.
So just with the coins turning into the smokestacks, we have a lot of things that animation does where it kind of makes visual metaphors, right? Your money becomes the factories that are running the war. And then in this sequence, we're going to see them saying the Axis are evil, right? We have all kinds of visual and auditory cues in here to tell us that they're evil.
Taxes to keep them coming. Taxes to beat to earth the evil destroyer of freedom and peace.
So we get, the dark red, we get the bump, 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 right? Just very dramatic. Obviously, the way that they're staging the big bad Nazi, whatever it is, robot, I don't know. It looks really scary. You're looking up at it. It's just very terrifying. And we're showing a lot of violence here, but it's done in a Disney-safe way. The news could often be very distressing, which a lot of scholars have shown shut people down, and they're less willing to entertain whatever idea it is. But Disney is safe, so everyone felt, fine watching it. So a lot of different things going into that animated short to make it the very effective piece of propaganda it was. So on the aesthetic side, Times Magazine claimed that it gets its propaganda across with the anesthetic blessing of laughter and great good humor. And the short was nominated for an Oscar for Best Animated Short. So aesthetically, people loved it. What's even more impressive is how it functioned as propaganda. So The U.S. Treasury Department estimated that more than 60 million Americans saw the short, and according to a Gallup poll at the time, 37% willingness to pay their taxes, generating billions of income for Uncle Sam, which is wild. A Donald Duck short helped save U.S. Treasury, but that's what it was. The success of the short also created a good relationship between Disney and the Treasury, and in 1943, Disney gave the Treasury permission to use their characters on war bonds. So if you find old school war bonds, you'll see a bunch of Disney characters on it, which is always just like a little, I don't know, weird. The Treasury and the military weren't Disney's only government clients. They made materials for almost every office and branch of the government, but a few that are interesting. We have the Conservation Division of the War Production Board made shorts. There we go. Made shorts like out of the frying pan into the firing lane. This one teaches Minnie Mouse how to save her bacon grease to donate to the war cause. Apparently, bacon grease can be converted into glycerin, which I did not know. And it also shows a picture of Mickey in soldier garb, like he's off in the war. Mickey shows up in very, very few of these shorts. It is focused on many of the other animated characters of the time. The Department of Agriculture also used Disney a lot. This one is called Food Will Win the War, and it shows how important American agriculture was at the time period, and it reassured Americans on the home front that even if food is being sent to the soldiers, there's still enough food for you to eat, please stop freaking out, was basically the tone of that cartoon. And it featured Disney's Three Little Pigs, which I feel like was a choice when you're talking about like food that Disney is or that America is producing. And their longest relationship was with the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. He was actually working with them before the war started. So this Cleanliness Brings Health is part of what he made for them. It's part of a series called Health for the Americas. Roosevelt established this office in 1940 to combat the spread of Axis influence, and these films were intended to spread goodwill for the U.S. by sharing hygiene tips with uneducated people in Latin America. I'm not 100% sure what the thought process was behind that one, but like that's where they're going with it. Even though we have all of these things, we have all of this propaganda that's very clearly being influenced by the U.S. government, Walt Disney made plenty of material, it's important to remember that these artists weren't mindlessly churning out exactly what the government thought, and they did include their own opinions, and of course that's still a form of propaganda. So we get shorts like Donald Gets Drafted. It's the first in a 6-part series showing Donald in military life. As the first one, it shows Donald getting drafted, going to get his physical, and entering military life. I'm running so short on time and I'm not even halfway through this, so I'm just going to talk you through it really quick. If you want to watch it, scan the QR code, watch it at home. You can actually find all of this online very easily, or all of these shorts. I have links to where you can find it online. Anyway, so the short starts with Donald getting his draft card, and then we see him walking through a bunch of signs on his way to the draft office. You can see it. This is one of the signs, and they're all like, yeah, the Army's great. Like, the generals are all friendly. Everybody loves you. You get breakfast in bed is literally one of the signs, right? It's just really, really funny. And there's a song playing in the background. The Army Isn't the Army Anymore. It's one of 2 songs that I'm going to talk about today that were so popular that the albums actually sold over 1 million copies during the war. So the Army Isn't the Army Anymore was you used to have to walk 10 miles to get beans, and now we bring you breakfast in bed is one of the lines. And the song plus the signs, it's a critique of propaganda, right? They're like, this is what people are telling you about the Army life. Now let's go see what Donald's doing in Army life, and it's not bad, right? Then we get to see Donald's life in the military. He goes through a physical where he's shown a card that has RED on it, and it's red, and they're like, what color is this red card? And he's like, red? And then they show him a green card that says green on it, and they're like, what color is this card? Or what color is this green card? And he goes, blue? And they're like, close enough. He has flat feet. Like, he failed so many of the things, and he still gets okay and put into the army. So at this point, they're very much making fun of the idea that, like, oh yeah, the army is full of all these fit guys. It's full of Donald Ducks. He also, like, all he wants to do is fly, and, like, all of these posters are like, oh, if you're a pilot, then women will want you. And then he gets there, and all he's doing is marching around. He doesn't get to fly. There are no women around. The short also clearly ridicules what the Army considers discipline. So his commanding officer is Pete, also from Disney's cast of characters. And Pete, like, threatens him with bodily violence to make him stay in the military. He makes him stand on top of an ant pile and stay at attention to teach him discipline. Like, there's all of these things where it's like, oh, these are ridiculous things. We shouldn't be doing these things, right? So all of this has to be done through humor. So all of the stuff is funny, but when you get to the end, all of it's funny, but it also shows Donald getting hurt, feeling bad, and getting mad, and you feel for the duck. But then the short ends with him peeling potatoes, and the song comes back on, and he peels one of the potatoes and holds up the skin, and it says "Phooey," his catch line. So it's, ends on a laugh because we have to couch it in humor, right? The short's impact is kind of interesting. The short is a bit of a contradiction. So on the one hand, don't you do it? Okay. On the one hand, due to the speed at which the film was made and released, for many Americans, it gave the first glimpse into the reality of life in the forces before many of them had heard about it from friends, neighbors, or even loved ones. On the other hand, as we just saw, the cartoon actually seems to satirize the falseness of American military propaganda and parody military discipline. This critical tone could possibly be due to Karl Barks, one of the main writers of the short, who had come to be a Disney legend because of his work developing the Disney Ducks. Barks was a pacifist who found the war stupid and pointless after seeing what World War I did to his own generation. And he was the one who came up with elements like the song and its juxtaposition with the posters. So we see his very specific individual influence impacting this thing that was paid for by the government to be put out as propaganda. It seems like these contradictions would make it less effective as propaganda, but somehow it ended up working. This was a well-beloved short during the war. Scholar Tracy Mullet brings these contradictions together by arguing that showing the difficult parts of Army life allowed audiences on the home front to understand the sacrifices made by soldiers on the front lines and the terrible conditions they were often forced to live in. However, as Donald was willing to make these sacrifices, audiences responded well to the cartoon and its overall message. So essentially, yeah, the short somehow both had Barks's conscientious dissent in it, and yet made the public on the home front appreciate the soldiers more, rather than turning them against the war or the military. And that is Disney magic, if there ever was any. So, we also have Walt's influence on the propaganda. I'm going to talk about Victory Through Air Power. We're not going to watch any of it, but I'm going to give you some background on it. It's based on a nonfiction book of the same name, which essentially argued that World War II would be won or lost through aerial warfare. He argues that hostile countries would start bombing the U.S., like Germany did the UK, and that the U.S. needed to become the strongest air power in the world if it wanted to stay in power. So Walt read the book and believed in its message so much that he produced the film with his own money. All right, and you can watch it later. It's a feature-length film. It's the only feature-length propaganda that they made, and it's fascinating. Okay. There is circumstantial evidence that this film did act exactly what Walt intended. So although it was released publicly, it was intended to convince politicians to more heavily focus on our air forces. Walt even sent this film to Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt when they met at the Quebec Conference, which you can see them up there. Film historian Leonard Maltin goes so far as to say that Disney's animated film changed FDR's way of thinking, as he agreed that the original author was right and made the commitment to long-range bombing only after seeing the film. Likewise, later Roy E. Disney, who is Walt's nephew, said in an interview that victory through air power aided in prompting President Roosevelt to commit U.S. military forces to a full-scale aerial attack. In fact, the Quebec Conference, where Walt sent FDR and Churchill to film, is where FDR finally confirmed the combined bomber offensive between the Allies. This order had technically been given by the Allies earlier, 2 months earlier, but it was never officially sanctioned by FDR until the Quebec Conference. I can't find anything where FDR talks about victory through air power, but many historians think it played a part in him making his decision and going ahead and officially sanctioning it. So, no matter what really tipped FDR's hand, Rady argues that if it wasn't for the Disney Studios, there may never have been an airstrike on Japan, because the airstrikes, including the nuclear bombs, for Japan didn't start until after FDR saw Disney's victory through air power. So this is a way that Disney had a very demonstrable effect on World War II. Finally, we have their kind of more traditional propaganda, which was just, hey, hate the Germans and the Japanese, right? Disney released several of these, or kind of more social education. Many of these cartoons do not say anywhere on the cartoon themselves that they were made at the behest of the US government. Even so, unpublished minutes from a meeting between Disney executives and a government representative lays out provisions for the handling of other proposed subjects beyond what the US government explicitly paid Disney to make for propaganda, and the way in which the Disney Studios believed animation could convey these subjects to audiences effectively. Perhaps the most famous of these is The Führer's Face, another Donald Duck cartoon. The basic plot of this is Donald Duck is having a nightmare. You do not know that until the end of the cartoon. I cannot even imagine going to a movie theater in 1943, 42, whatever, 43, and starting this cartoon and Donald's a Nazi, and there's no explanation for that, but he's having a nightmare. And it's just him living through a day of like a typical German man's life. But of course, it is hyperbolized. I am going to show a bit of this one because it's fascinating, and it's the most well-known of the shorts from the time period. So as I said, despite the notation of government funding in the archival documents, the American public would not have been aware that the short was made under the government contract. Audiences simply believed that they were going to be viewing another Donald Duck cartoon because you'll not see the US government anywhere on that slide, right? So it was funded by the US government, they just decided not to tell anyone that. Okay. Remember, this is a nightmare, also somewhat racist if it is coming. Okay, so in this, that is the introduction to Donald in this short. And we see swastikas everywhere. We have, like, he's forced to howl in his sleep, to pictures and everything. This is actually essentially propaganda about propaganda. So making fun of like how Germans were forced to basically worship, not worship, that's not the right word, but they're indoctrinated to the swastika and to all of these pictures. But of course, this is a piece of propaganda making that point. So there is some irony there. The band that's playing, you just saw them very briefly, are all based on famous propagandists from the Axis powers. So like they're trying to make sure you are aware that that's what they're doing with this short. And as with a lot of propaganda in World War II from both sides of the war, these cartoons are often racist and dehumanizing. Historian Brian Nia, in discussing these shorts, noted that the Hitler character somewhat realistic, while the Japanese Emperor Hiroto character doesn't even look human. You see this in much of the imagery of the Japanese in this time period, where they are sometimes even explicitly made into animals. Similarly, the white band members at least look human, while the Japanese character in the band barely does. These types of portrayals contribute to the general sense that Japanese people were all the same and less than human. It's a huge problem in Disney animation. Warner Brothers was also making propaganda cartoons. Theirs are somehow more racist than Disney's are. Dr. Seuss did a lot of political cartoons in this period that are super racist against the Japanese. It was a whole issue for a lot of stuff. There's too much to talk about, folks. In the rest of the short, we see Donald get a loaf of bread out of a safe to eat, because that's how much, there's rationing going on. And he cuts into it with a saw, because it's basically a stone at this point. And he his only protein is he has a perfume bottle that's oud bacon and eggs or something like that. And he squirts that in his mouth. So it's making fun of the lack of food. However, the Great Depression just happened, and at this point in time, the US are on war rations. So they weren't eating much better, right? So it's interesting that the short is making fun of this thing that is a part of American's life. Then we get to see his work day. He's in a factory. He's being held at gunpoint at several points in time to make sure that he's doing things correctly. He has to work 48 hours in a day. He has to salute Hitler's picture every time it comes past him. For some reason, it's on the assembly line that he's working on, so he keeps having to do it while trying to work. It's just, there's all these ways that it's making fun of the working conditions in Germany at the time. That being said, most of these same tactics are used to talk about life in the US in Disney's other shorts. So the mountains of potatoes he has to peel in Donald Gets Drafted, and the nonstop marching are similar to all of the work that we're seeing this Donald have to do. We're seeing ridiculing both propaganda and authority figures, again, in Donald Gets Drafted and in this one. Pete keeps Donald in the army with the same kind of threat of violence that we see in here. You get almost the exact same imagery at one point in this short. And the song is just so tongue-in-cheek. There's some lines when Defer says, "We never will be slaves, we hile, but still we work like slaves." While Defer brags and lies and rants and raves, we hile and work into our graves. Is what is being sung as he's being forced into the factory at the end of a bayonet. The features that we see in something like Donald Gets Drafted are even further exaggerated in Defer's face, but they exist in Disney's criticism of the US too, which is fascinating to me, right? And of course, things are complicated and good and bad, they're really complicated in World War II, but it's fascinating to me that we see that kind of leaking through in the criticism of America in their other shorts. This short was shockingly effective. Disney and the US government both thought that shorts like these were, an example of good propaganda. Lampooning the Nazi state, ridiculing Hitler's personality, elevating the religious and moral superiority of the Allies, exposing the lies, executions, and oppression of its people, and undermining the ideology at its core were seen as the most effective way to turn the South American people away from their temptation to endorse Nazism, which is why they had Disney working on shorts for them as well. In particular, this short was viewed in contemporary society as the film that solidified Disney's commitment to the war effort as a citizen of the United States. Moreover, the short cemented Donald's position as the figurehead of the Disney studios for the propaganda war against the Nazi threat. It's also been regarded as a significant and well-made piece of art. It won an Oscar for Best Animated Short. It's the only Donald short that ever won that Oscar. And it was selected as number 22 in the 50 greatest cartoons as selected by 1,000 animation professionals. So it's considered a really important piece of art. And yet, it was banned in Russia for 6 years, starting in, I think it was 2010 to 2016, for being too extremist. Russians called that too extremist. I just want y'all to sink that in. And Disney doesn't even acknowledge that this exists. You will not find this in any Disney stuff. They just kind of pretend none of that happened, which is really fascinating. Okay, Disney's impact. This propaganda was successful by a lot of different metrics. The government continued to pay Disney to make more cartoons, and some of the training videos were used for decades after they were made. The cartoons measurably changed opinions around things such as paying taxes and the use of planes in the war effort. And some of these cartoons were nominated and or won awards based on artistic merit. And okay, I'm speed running this at this point, all right. So Disney was really invested in this. Disney actually reached out to the government before the government reached out to Disney, because at this point, they just had several flops, and they were losing money hand over fist. Plus, there was a writer's strike because Walt made some bad decisions. So they wanted to be helping out, so that the government would pay them. Walt was also, this is a short that Walt made, or that Disney Studios made for the Canadian government. They were working with the Inter-American Office starting in 1941. They actually sent Walt to South America as an ambassador of peace in what is now called the Good Neighbor Tour. So this influx of money is what kept Disney afloat in this time period. And Brady even argues that if it wasn't for the US military, the Walt Disney Company may not even exist today, because they probably would have folded during the war. So one of the other ways you can really see how much Disney meant to the common person is through the insignias they made. These are just a few examples of them. These are military insignia that represented particular units of the military. Disney produced over 1,200 of them during the war for free. They didn't just make these for everyone who asked, or sorry, they didn't make these for every single unit that existed in the US military. They had to be requested. So over 1,200 units in the US military requested Disney to make their insignia. And some of these are still used to this day. I have a lot more information on this if you want to ask about it later, don't have time. Anyway, it is really interesting, and Donald is still our favorite. In this, you can see there's so much stuff. Oh my gosh. Okay, Donald Duck had at least 216 unit designs, way more than any of the other characters, which is really fascinating. Okay, skipping all over this, there's so much, y'all. All right, Disney's continued impact. So between their propaganda cartoons, their insignia designs, and honestly a bunch of other stuff that I can't even vaguely reference right now, Disney had a shocking impact on the hearts and minds of US soldiers, politicians, and everyday citizens during World War II. While the US government doesn't pay Disney to make propaganda anymore, we can still see echoes of this work in the 21st century. So for example, after 9/11, they started making these expressing yourself shorts on Disney Channel where various stars would talk about their reactions to 9/11, and it was supposed to help kids process 9/11, which is what a lot of the shorts from World War II were supposed to be doing. A lot of the MCU is seen as military propaganda. If you've ever seen Captain America, the original Avenger, or the first, whatever, he's like actually propaganda in that movie. Like that's what he was originally before he became a soldier. And then Disney produced entertainment during COVID-19, including this series of shorts, How to Stay at Home, which was very similar to something like The New Spirit, where it's like teaching you how to be at home at COVID and not like spread your germs, right? There's even one on how to put your mask on. That top square is about how to wear your mask properly, right? So they're still making propaganda to this day. In looking at Disney's role in World War II and its continued legacy, I'm not trying to paint them as heroes or villains. They did cool stuff, and they did some really shady stuff, and it's usually all mixed together throughout all of their things. What I'm interested in is how material seemingly relegated to children has such an impact during national tragedies. While always claiming that Disney animation has been for adults, he was actually very passionate about that fact. You can read his full quote there. And yet, adults who love Disney, who are commonly referred to as Disney adults, have received a lot of criticism in the media and online in the past few years. Tom Haynes calls Disney adults the most terrifying people on the planet. Alyssa Smith calls Disney adults an epidemic. And E.J. Dixon calls Disney adults the most hated group on the internet. A lot of love going on there. So what I hope today's presentation demonstrates is that even though people ridicule Disney adults for still liking kids stuff, when times get tough, there's something about that kid stuff that calls to adults. And Disney's kid stuff has done so for a century, though I would argue that if we look at children's media more broadly, we can see it happening for much longer than that. Whether it's gathering communal support for the government's social programs during our darkest hours here on American soil, or reminding soldiers of the home they're fighting for, there's just something about Disney that speaks to us on a deep level that simultaneously feels personal, drawing us back to fond memories, and also helps us connect with others. And there's nothing silly about that at all. So, thank you. All right, I know I'm like at time, but if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. And also, these books are just about Disney during World War II. So if you want more information, those are great. Yes?
Would you like to hear a short experience that I had in World War II?
What?
Is anybody interested? Okay.
Certainly.
Okay, then I'll stand up there and tell you about it quick. Here, put the deal in. As soon as I get that up there. I lived in New Jersey at the time during the war. I was a 5 or 6 year old boy. And everybody had to be, trying to get us very patriotic. All the people would come around. What used to scare me was the fact that the air raid wardens would come around and knock on our door, sometimes with rifles, and scare the heck out of a little 5 or 6 year old boy and our kids, and say, put those lights out, pull the curtains down, and hide. My mother would take us all in the bedroom and resort to the Lord's Prayer. And of course, I think she did that when there was storms going on too. It didn't make a difference, but anything was happening. Anyway, my dad would take us to museums, to movies and stuff like that, and parades. And so we'd watch these parades taking place, and I'd see the soldiers marching. And my mother's cousin had sent home some souvenirs that he had captured when he was over in Europe. And since I was so excited about seeing the 3 soldiers that they brought back from Iwo Jima, Era Hayes, Ronald, and John Bradley, the 3 soldiers who had survived Iwo Jima that helped carry the flag, put the flag up. And so the president felt, bring them back to the United States so he can sell more war bonds. So Dad taking me to the movies, I was so excited about that. And the souvenirs that my mother's cousin sent home happened to be one with the Nazi flag. So I snuck it out of my mother's bureau drawer and stuck it on a stick that I found in the yard. And I'm marching down the street in Patterson, near Patterson, New Jersey, where the defense plant is at. And somebody called my mother up and said, you ever get that kid off the street when somebody shoots him? And of course, my 9-year-old sister Marion come running down and ripped the flag off me, smacked me, and rained on my parade. You know, at this point, I had no understanding of what was taking place. So when my dad came home, I probably got another spanking. But I do remember him taking us out the back and taking that flag and burning it. He says, I'm burning this flag before somebody else burns our house down. So it's amazing how we talk about propaganda and how people get involved. So here is a little tiny little boy. So if I could be embedded with that stuff like that, imagine how anybody else is. So it's a little scary type of situation, but pretty exciting.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? Oh.
Are those films that he made during the war, are those available today commercially?
Not commercially. So the animated films, you can find everything that I showed you today can be found on YouTube and or the Internet Archive. You can watch them or download them. They're preserved for historical reasons, but if you go on Disney Plus, you're not going to find them. I think Victory Through Air Power is on Disney Plus, but the shorts themselves aren't. But yeah, you can find them all on YouTube and Internet Archive. And they're
Thank you so much for interesting talk. What I'm wondering is that, you continuously talking about the continued impact of Disney, but there was a lot of war between right now and so I wonder what's Disney's relationship with the government in Korean War or Vietnam War, because that's what they're very specialized to, those depicting the Asians as enemies. So I wonder how the government using this extremely successful propaganda tool in other wars. And also I wonder what's the role of women that the Disney tried to say, obviously the taxpayers and all these the potential soldiers who can be drafted are men, right? But then also women play such a important role during the World War II. So if they have any contribution to the representation of women, I wonder.
Yeah, so starting with the relationship with the US government, the article by Ray that I cite, that's his entire thing. It's like what happened after World War II. But essentially the US government's like, yeah, we're not gonna pay you for this anymore. So Disney stopped making it for some strange reason. So they didn't do anything officially for any of the wars between World War II, and the first time you start really seeing them picking up propaganda again is during, what was the one in the 90s? Desert Storm, thank you. Desert Storm is when they start picking up again. So there's not really anything in between that time period, which is really interesting. And then your question about women, so there was a series of shorts with Minnie Mouse being like, here's what you can do, women. I talked about the one about the bacon grease, but they made others as well. But in the studio itself, there were, sorry, I'm looking for the number, 165. So 165 male employees from Disney Studios that went and served in the military. And they had all these orders coming in, and they're like, great. So what they did is they actually, a lot of women have worked at Disney from the very beginning, but they were relegated to being colorists, which means the men would draw everything, and then the women would go in and on every single piece of film have to color in all of the colors. But they weren't allowed to design anything for themselves. So during the war, Disney just promoted a bunch of those women, and they became the artists who were creating a lot of the material for, during the war period. So it was one of the best times, I guess, for women in Disney Studios, at least in the early years. So that's kind of fun.
Did he do anything about the women that built the airplanes, in the war? Because these women had played a major part in building a lot of our bombers and tanks and things of that sort.
I haven't seen all of their educational films from this time period, because there's a ridiculous amount of them. None of the ones I've seen have been on anything to do with that. But considering everything Disney owns now, I'm sure they have made something in the last 70 years that is on that particular topic.
Why not more Mickey?
Why not more Mickey? So Mickey actually fell out of favor during the Great Depression, and Donald really became the star of the studio. He was everybody's favorite, or not everybody's, but he was the audience favorite. Tracy Mullet has a book about Disney and Warner Brothers during the Great Depression and World War II, and her argument is just that Mickey was too nice. He was too clean. That wasn't the mood people were in during the Great Depression. So he just didn't really fit. And I think that's really interesting because when you see the same thing happen around, for example, 9/11, everything that Disney produced right after 9/11 as kind of a tribute to what happened featured Mickey and not other characters. So there's been a way that we've shifted how we kind of relate to cartoon characters when we're thinking about national tragedies. And I don't know what that shift is because I haven't studied the years in between. But yeah, Donald became the front man of the studio for a couple decades there. Others? Okay. I'm also happy to answer more questions if you have them, but I know we're way over time.
You're good, thank you so much. And next month's speaker is going to be Ken Bridges. He writes the history articles in the paper, several papers actually. And also our Audie Murphy Day is coming up on May 16th. So everybody have a great day and see you guys next time.